central planning isn't supposed to work, right?
Right. Yeah.
And there's been many cases of countries which have tried to do this. Germany, Germany, Japan, many other countries missed out on the internet because there was a centrally directed effort towards these heavy industries or manufacturing, which actually turned out not to be relevant in the 21st century.
Yeah. No, it's definitely perilous. So if you look at, China has a list of key industries. It's called the Strategic Emerging Industries. They came up with it basically in 2010. It built on previous iterations of industrial policy. Most of it is not really an effort to predict with high degree of specificity what comes next. They're mostly pretty obvious things like semiconductors, industrial automation, new materials, all this kind of stuff that I think would be on anyone's list if you were just sort of running a VC fund and saying, what are the sectors that we think are...
But most VC funds are like losing money. And so it like actually is like maybe like a couple of firms in the world which are able to make this prediction correctly.
Yeah.
So it's like a couple firms in the world plus the Ministry of Information Technology in China are the only people who can predict the future.
No. I mean, I think basically the analogy with the VC fund is a pretty good one. I've made it many times. Think of China as like a giant VC fund that is just willing to lose huge amounts of money for a really long time on the assumption that a few of the bets will pan out, right? And so China as a state, as a government, is uniquely able to throw a lot of money at things for a really long time, not care about what the returns are, and say, we're going to identify this universe of potential winners. We're going to, promote all of them, basically. And some of them may work and some of them may not. Yeah. And the successes will pay for the failures.
I guess I'm still confused on why many other countries have tried similar things. Like Needy was a Japanese version of this, right?
Yeah.
So, and look at their economy now and their high-tech sector.
So a couple things. So first of all, I would say that even if you go back to like 2005, 2006, when they started thinking about this, saying that green energy was going to be an important industry in the future, everyone was saying that, right? You had the Kleiner Perkins guy, John Doerr, right? John Doerr was the big VC who said, circa 2007, I'm going to put all of my bets on green energy because this is the future, right? He turned out to be wrong from the standpoint of his investment returns. But he turned out to be, I think, totally correct in terms of saying this is a really big thing. So it was just not that wild a bet to say that green energy was going to be really important. And so we should place a lot of bets on that. So, but why does this work and why is this different from a central planning thing, right? I think that's a really important point. So a couple things. So first of all, the Chinese system, like the systems that preceded it in East Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and so forth, has always put a lot of emphasis on being good at exporting. So there are a lot of pressures within the system to create industries that can export, right? The reason this is important is if you have a totally closed system, which frankly is what I think Donald Trump is trying to create in the United States, and people are just producing essentially for domestic consumption, there's no incentive to keep up with global technology developments. So if you have this constant export focus, essentially what everyone is trying to do, if you have a closed domestic market, you can rig the domestic market and buy off your connections in government to make sure that you as a company have your market share. So there are a lot of ways to win that do not involve technological upgrading. And that is what dooms all import substitution regimes. If you have an export-driven economy, you can't rig the global economy. Ultimately, you have to compete, right? And you can't compete just on price. You have to compete on raising your game. And Japan did this successfully. Taiwan did this successfully. Korea did this successfully. China's done that successfully. So that's answer one, is that you had this underlying system which was heavily incentivized in technological upgrading across the board. So that's what you were sitting on top of. And it was completely different than the old central planning regime, which was autarkic and inward-looking. Right? Second, you had this domestic competition environment, which was really cutthroat and which involved a lot of international companies, right? And this is a little bit of a difference to Japan, which always kept the foreign companies out of its domestic market. Their companies operated globally, very, very well, but the domestic market was very protected. China's domestic market was not that protected. And so they were always willing to bring in companies that they thought would be able to, spark some technological change. And again, you can say, so what this did is it created a field in which maybe the government has the right ideas, maybe they don't, but you have a crucible in which their ideas can be tested. A very competitive domestic market where you have a lot of the big international players doing their own thing as well. And so that the things that work get some validation and you can keep building on those successes. So I think that's a really important, and then just the sheer scale at which they were able and willing to support, what appeared to be losing bets for a long time, does matter, right? And you could contrast their view, for example, in solar energy, where they said, look, we want to be big in solar energy. And again, they started thinking about this in 2005. What do we need to do? So they identified the whole supply chain from the raw silicon inputs through all of the modules and to the finished panels. And they said, we want to be in every stage of that. So they had a pretty deliberate strategy of trying to create people at every point in the supply chain. And they were willing to go through cycles of people not making any money. Comparison, obviously, in the United States is the U.S. government gives one loan to one company, Solyndra. It goes bad, and everyone says, this is proof that industrial policy does not work, right? And I think China actually has the right answer to that question, and we had the wrong answer to that question. You have to be willing to accept some failures and some loss of, government money along the way if you want to get to the end. But I really stress the ecosystem because a lot of this would not have worked just by the government saying, oh, we want to do solar. It would not have worked unless you had this broader ecosystem of export-driven manufacturing, high competition, and international participation across many, 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 many sectors of the economy. They all converged to create a successful result.
Yeah. I want to put some of these bureaucrats in a Factorio speedrun and see how they do. If you enjoyed this clip, you can watch the full episode here and subscribe for more clips. Thanks.